You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
I wake up in the morning and I feeling a vibe. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways, hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Zella Palmer. Today, y'all, I'm so excited to have the regal, the one and only Madame Givonna Joseph, the founder of Opera Creole. But I'm going to get into just all of her accolades in a second. But I just wanted to, just give her her flowers as I always do when I see her, because she has made a huge impact in my life and has really also taught me a lot about opera and Black composers in opera. And I think about New Orleans and, walking and living in New Orleans is like walking in a time capsule. Every step you take on every block, you are transported to another time and era. And everyone in New Orleans who is born and raised here, or those who, like myself, who believe in New Orleans and the culture and history of it, will tell you everything about New Orleans. I mean, we know who lived, where in the 1800s and the 1900s. We are walking historians. So it must have been a strange world after the Louisiana Purchase, when Americans came to Louisiana and, specifically to New Orleans, and saw these free people of color walking around speaking three languages, traveling back and forth to Paris, um, you know, and just singing opera, anywhere on the corner.
Yes.
So, and I think of the movie Chevalier and
Yes.
Bridgerton, and how there's movies that are coming out that are finally telling stories of Black contributions
Yes.
to that era of opera, and that we were there. And
And
I remember.
actually, hilariously, that you should mention Bridgerton, because my interns are drinking Queen Charlotte tea right now.
Oh, there we go. And so I think about my parents, God rest their souls. They
Yeah.
loved opera. We went often in Chicago, but it wasn't until I moved to New Orleans when I fell in love with opera. And I
Mm.
have to thank Madame Givonna Joseph. She and her daughter, her beautiful daughter, Aria, have been on a mission to produce unpublished, unsung operas by Black composers. And one in particular is Edmond Dede. Born in New Orleans in 1827, a free man of color. We will talk about his history and how Opera Creole spearheaded the debut of Dede's never performed opera, Morjane, 187 years later in New Orleans, thanks to Opera Creole. And I just want you all to kind of get an idea of who Givonna is. She is the founder and artistic director of the award-winning Opera Creole. Givonna Joseph's research on 19th century New Orleans free classical and operatic composers of color and Creole history and heritage was recently featured on CBS Saturday Morning, NBC Nightly News, NPR, and in magazines such as Black Enterprise, 64 Parish, and Atlas Obscura. I'm just so proud of what she has done, that she never gives up. And despite the challenges that she has had over the years, that she is truly um, telling our ancestors' story. So let's welcome, I want to welcome Givonna, Madame Givonna Joseph, and let's time travel. What was New Orleans like when opera was queen?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I love to try time travel, so I love that idea. 'Cause that you walked in the French Quarter, and it's like the ancestors are there. The feeling is just so strong. And I always say that I believe that it was opera and the pumping system that saved New Orleans because in the 1700s, things were not, it was not a very hospitable place to live. We had not developed proper sanitation because we were below sea level. It was always a little water and pestilence and, all of that. And the powers that be said, let's bring all of our wonderful culture into the city, the balls and the opera. And I read in Henry Cayman's book um, that the women used to leave their houses in regular clothes, street clothes, and someone would carry their costume or their ball gown. And when they would get to the venue, there was a place to wash their legs and feet and get all dressed up and enjoy the opera or enjoy the ball. And so we have always done everything for music. I mean, that's the main thing. We will walk through mud and crawfish heads and everything else
So
for
true.
music. So I just
Mm,
love that story.
mm. So story time. Tell us about the great Creole of color composers. Who were they?
Edmond Dede is the most famous. Charles Lucien Lambert and his son Lucien. Lucien was born in France. Victor Eugene McCarthy, Samuel Snail, and Basile Barre would become free later on. Um, and there are a few others that, like Constantin de Berck, was a violinist and conductor at the Théâtre de la Renaissance, which they formed their orchestra in 1840 in the building that still stands on Elysian Fields in Dauphine. So there was quite a few who were not necessarily composers, but many, many musicians, because they were able to play in the pit of the opera houses. And the fact that the orchestra formed in 1840 was 100 men, mostly free men of color and some whites. So we managed integrated orchestra as early as 1840.
Mm,
The women are not as well known, but there were very, very many women who were classical pianists. From the Lambert family, 7 musicians came. So Charles and oh goodness, his brother became, I'll think of it, his brother became pianist for King Don Pedro in Portugal. And there were women who were performers as well. The only woman composer that we have a record of is Sister Seraphine, who came from Puerto Rico and joined the Sisters of the Holy Family, started the
mm,
music program at St. Mary's Academy, and we have one piece that remains that was not lost, a piano piece called La Puertorriqueña.
mm,
But the women are much harder to find because the historical records will say Mademoiselle last name and might say a piece that they played, but you don't know if it was theirs or So I got to get back to doing more digging in that arena.
mm. Patrick Dupre Quigley on NBC
Yes,
Nightly News said Morjane is the most important piece of American music that no one has ever heard of.
yeah,
The
more
American
so.
musical
Yeah,
community has been deprived of this masterpiece for over 130 years. It is high
yes,
time that Dede and his music take their rightful place in the American musical canon. Now, the
yes.
nearly 550-page score written by Edmond Dede was unknown for more than a century, and it
Hmm.
reminds me of the 90s movie for my film nerds out there, The Red Violin, where it was passed down through different collectors' hands until it came home to New Orleans and to Opera Creole. How did you find out about Mojane?
Mojan.
Mojan, excuse
Yes,
me. My French
Mojan.
is awful, y'all.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's just like a fairy tale story. We found out through the writer for the New York Times article. He dug to find out what happened to it after Dede passed away. And his son became a composer, but um, we don't know if he had it or if he passed it on to someone. But it ended up in a suburb of Paris in a barn. Some guy had collected 10,000 scores, and it sat there until like 2007, when this guy decided he wanted to sell the collection, and he contacted Harvard, who, very few institutions would have the money to buy 10,000 scores. So they sent them someone there. They bought the scores. Um, and when it got back to Harvard, this one librarian going through all of these scores, she saw this. She said, Edmond Dede. And she started calling around because she wasn't quite sure. She said, this is interesting. And so when she found out who he was, she sent it to be digitized. Once it was digitized, they sent a copy, back then when people were still burning CDs, to
Mhm.
to Xavier here in New Orleans, and I got the score from Xavier, and so it was many years of trying to begging for money because it was all in his handwriting. It had never gone through edit or any of those things, so it was all handwritten, full orchestra in French, and so that was the task ahead, just to get it into modern sheet music.
Mm. And so tell us about Edmond Dede. I mean, and what happened? Why don't we know about Morjan? Why was it never published? Why was it never performed?
Well, it was supposed to be presented by Opera Bordeaux because he was living and composing and conducting an orchestra in Bordeaux, France. And at that time, the government, oh, hopefully we don't go back to this, but the government would be the head of these cultural institutions. And so the leadership changed, and the relationship that he'd had before was no longer there. And so it didn't happen. Um, he sent it to, well, he went to move to Paris thinking he could get Paris Opera to do it. And um, it just never happened. We don't know um, if that was, he had not done a whole lot of grand opera before then, and it's almost like he said, "I'm gonna really show y'all what I can do," and maybe that was just a little too much for him. And like, we're not going that far with you, bro. So it didn't happen, um, and then somehow it got into this collector's hands. Um, I love talking about Edmond Dede because he is, to me, a hero of New Orleans. We found out that this opera, Morjan, is the oldest existing opera by a American-born Black composer. We know Chevalier was the first, but
Mhm.
this is the oldest existing opera by an American-born Black composer. Um, and it's to me, that's quite a feather in New Orleans' cap. The fact that he was so determined, I always tell young people, he was determined to be who he was born to be. And even as a man of not mixed, a non-mixed race, that his melanin may have gotten in his way sometimes. He presented and published his music. When he found out that he had an opportunity to go to the Paris Conservatory and was trying to raise money, he took a daring step to go down to Mexico to work in a cigar factory to
Mm,
get enough money to go. And at the time he went, they were starting to kick free people out of Louisiana. If you were freed after a certain point, there was like a grandfathering or something. If you were freed after a certain point, you had to leave because we were becoming too plentiful. So he almost couldn't get back. So he had to come back in on a different name to get back to New Orleans. And once he got back to New Orleans, the Creole community gathered around him, helped him to raise the rest of the money to get to France.
mm,
And not long after he was in the conservatory, he was hired to conduct Bellini's opera La Sonnambula at the Grand Théâtre de Bordeaux. So, sometimes in modern days we find all the excuses of why we can't do something and why something may be scary or why, well, if I try that, that's not going to work. That was clearly not the way he thought. And I just really I'm so inspired by him all the time. Um, and so he became the great Edmond Dede, whether anybody liked it or not.
Mm, 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 mm.
So, and one of my favorite things, Zella, and one of his first foray into it was more musical theater than opera, but it was like his first foray into doing that. Uh, it was called Françoise et Tortillard, and it was about this young woman who was a domestic who wanted to open a restaurant. Is that not New Orleans? And she's in love with this soldier by the name of Tortillard, but she keeps telling him, you would look so great with a tart-shaped hat. And, I want to open a restaurant. And so because he was in love with her, it's all comedy because he's trying to convince her he knows how to cook, but he doesn't. And
Mm,
so we were able to present it presented a couple of years ago. And we took the spoken part and modernized it into her saying, I want to be like Leah Chase. I want to open a restaurant.
mm,
But,
mm, mm.
he had quite a sense of humor, and I really loved that, and even though he was in France at the time, it's still a very New Orleans piece.
It must have been a really full circle moment for you to, produce and to present his opera to the public at St. Louis Cathedral in
Yeah,
January,
yeah.
um, in this past January. I mean, what was that like? I mean, just organizing and Taylor, one of the amazing, opera singer here in New Orleans,
Mhm.
and just to put this together. I mean, how was that?
I always say, even though I was begging for 12 years just to be able to transcribe it, it was the timing, sometimes, we say that God may not come when you want him to, but he's always on time.
Mm,
And the timing of how this hit, how everything hit was perfect because I was again working on it. And then Patrick Quigley, who's also from New Orleans, but is now the artistic director of Opera Lafayette in Washington, D.C., he happened to stumble upon it at the same time. Someone said, you should talk to Givonna Joseph. And so we got together and it just went from there. Talk about a perfect partnership.
mm,
So the LPO, Historic New Orleans Collection, everybody came together, cathedral staff, and then that snowstorm hit, and I thought, my
oh my
goodness.
God.
Uh, so I said, well, this is New Orleans. It's gonna melt in a day. No. So we lost two rehearsals. We thought, how are we going to get this together? So we had that one rehearsal. We moved the performance a day to January 24th. We had the one rehearsal, and it just all came together. Even though there was still ice and a little snow on the ground, the cathedral was packed.
Hmm.
So with people standing against the walls, that just blew me away. And at first, I was concerned about doing it in the cathedral, and then Jean-Marie Honore told me that, well, it's a good thing you are because he was baptized in the cathedral. Um, I think it was January 20th, 1828, and we performed January 24th.
Mm,
So it was really, really a homecoming for him.
mm,
The descendants of his brother who remained in New Orleans, they were all there, and it was just perfection.
mm.
Um, And it was one of those moments when I said, "Giovanna, good that you just don't give up, just it's a message to never give up and keep going with your goals and things will happen and come together as they're supposed to."
I'm
And
so proud
I'm
of
really
you.
grateful for that.
I'm so proud of you. I mean, I've seen,
Thank you.
we're friends, and I've seen, you just push through many, 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 ups and downs, and you have been steadfast and faithful, and,
Thank you.
and I'm in awe, and even just having it at St. Louis Cathedral. I mean, as you said, he was baptized there. I mean, St.
Yeah,
Louis Cathedral. I mean, could you
yeah,
tell our audience the significance of St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans and just in America in general?
yeah. It's the oldest still operating cathedral in the country. Um, and it's I forget exactly when it was built, but it's been there since the 1700s. Um, it's a wonderful seat of a coordination between the Henriette DeLille, who is now on the path to sainthood, and her work with enslaved people, teaching them to read by teaching them the catechism with Bishop Blanc's approval, um, which was pretty radical. I love that. Uh, and the cathedral, because the King of France said enslaved people were not supposed to work on a Sunday, we all went to the cathedral on a Sunday, and then that allowed people the time in Congo Square, which allowed Africa to live, to thrive, and the rhythms and the music and all of what is still our culture um, was able to thrive because of that. Um, I know some of my family have history at the cathedral as well, and ironically, my daughter was a cantor and there for many years. She sang for the opening of the DeLille Chapel,
Hmm.
so it's really significant for us, and beautiful place, of course.
Mhm. Y'all, when we come back from after a few messages from our advertisers, we're going to talk about that one time I performed for Opera Creole. And we're going to talk about Givonna's journey and just running a Black owned, women led company and
Amazing.
telling the story of what it means to be Creole of color in New Orleans. So we'll be back after a few messages.
This episode is brought to you by Plugra European-style butter, crafted for those who demand precision and exceptional results in the kitchen. With 82% butter fat and a slow churn process, Plugra gives you flakier crusts, fluffier cakes, and rich, melt-in-your-mouth pastries. Because great baking starts with great butter. Unlike standard American butters, which have only 80% butter fat, Plugra ensures the ideal moisture and fat balance so your recipes turn out just right every time. That's why professional chefs trust Plugra and home bakers love it. Plugra's slow churn process creates a smooth, creamy butter that gives dough a soft, pliable texture, making rolling, folding, and laminating effortless. Whether you're perfecting a buttery pie crust or layering a delicate croissant, Plugra helps you bake with confidence. Experience the difference for yourself. Find Plugra in stores near you or visit plugra.com. That's Plugra.com.
Y'all, we're back. So, true story. Well, let me back up the story. Let's go back to 2015. I think it was around 2015. Um,
Yeah.
Dr. David Shields, he shared with me, a whole lot of research, and he's from South Carolina. But what stood out to me, and I went into a deep dive, was the story of Nellie Murray, a Creole de Couleur, a, you know, well-known, famed caterer of the elite society of New Orleans. She was a third generation enslaved cook at Bayou Gullah Plantation to the governor, the Louisiana governor, Paul Hebert,
Mhm.
and she was freed by de facto. Um, and she became the caterer of elite society, and not only in New Orleans, but in New York and Berlin and Paris. She was everywhere. She was, they wrote about her in the Daily Picayune in the 1800s and said it, asked her opinion. This a Black woman who was formerly enslaved, her opinion on European cooking and traveling the world. So she was something else. And I'm sure she was also catering for a lot of these balls, and the operas after,
Yeah.
and she was doing, incredible things. She even cooked for Susan B. Anthony when the suffrage convention came to New
Mhm.
Orleans. And so Leah Chase, when she was alive, the late Leah Chase, most, incredible woman I've ever met in life. I
Yes,
was
indeed.
able to raise funds with the late Sybil Haida Moriel, who was, former first lady of New Orleans, first Black
Yes,
woman to be the first lady of New Orleans when
yes,
her husband was mayor, and the Cummings, and it was just a collective of us that came together and said we're going to raise money to not only raise money to, fund the documentary of Leah Chase for that needed to be finished, but
mm,
we're also going to lift up the name of Nellie Murray because, there were so many Creole women who, you know, contributed to this long legacy of Creole cuisine, Creole culture, Creole music. I mean, it goes on and on. And Nellie Murray was one of them.
yes,
And Givonna was Madame Givonna played Nellie Murray at the feast. It was about 150 people that we had at this feast. Chef Duke Chase, was the executive of it of the nights. We had Chef BJ Dennis. I mean, it was just a fabulous event.
yeah,
And Opera Creole performed. She had her tignon on, her ball gown, and it's a clip of it is on YouTube, and I haven't brought it back yet, but
yeah,
it was just phenomenal, and I just am so thankful for you for that. And then fast forward, you produced an opera, and you said, "Do you want to be Nellie Murray
yeah,
in the opera?" I was like, "Me?" And so I was able to get the costume, but I just felt like a little kid again being on stage, And I was on stage just pretending like I was cooking. So, I
yeah,
have this love
yeah,
affair with
yes.
Nellie
And
Murray and the
all the
opera.
food
So
out
thank
for
you
the
for that.
ball. Yeah, yeah.
Ah,
Yeah,
so
that
tell us
was
about.
our Lions of Reconstruction that I wrote for the city's 300th birthday. So we got to
Mm,
get all of our wonderful heroes of 19th century New Orleans in it, and so I was really excited um, to have Nellie Murray in that because I just keep getting blown away of what we didn't know as children, all the information we didn't know, and then when I learned about Nellie Murray, it just made me think, how you look at the women in your family who cook. My mother was incredible. My mother would start cooking and people would just drive up. It's like the fumes just went. She was so incredible and she had so much dignity and pride in the way she cooked and I always kind of felt like that's so interesting that this something got passed down. There's something rich that happened that my mother embodied. And then you hear about Nellie Murray, and then you're surprised you didn't know, but then you're not surprised because food is such a wonderful art, a wonderful part of our DNA. And my mother was just so incredible. And most of the women, I'm not going to say all of them, but some of them, my dad was like,
mhm.
but
I don't need everybody's gumbo.
yeah, yeah. But my mother, oh my goodness. And
Mm,
we have all of these rich traditions. It's like even though we didn't know about Nellie Murray and all these people, there was something that lived in my parents and in my family, a certain kind of dignity that you knew something special was there. And so it just all made sense, you know.
mm,
It's all made sense.
mm. It does, and there's the queen of Creole cuisines. It's a long list of them.
Yeah,
And it's such an honor to really know them and to sit with them because I
yeah,
believe you understand what I'm talking about, and historians, New Orleans historians, understand that our
yeah,
work is spiritual, our work is ancestral, and literally you do sit with the ancestors because
yes,
they want to tell their stories, you
yes,
know. And
yes,
so what led you to opera? You talked about your mom cooking at home. What led
yeah.
you to opera?
Well, it's a funny thing. I always wanted to sing. My mom said I was singing before I could get sentences out. So
Mm.
running around the house singing. So that was always a thing. I started off, in church at school. Went to Catholic school, so of course I was singing in the choir. But it was when I went to do my first musical at 15 at North Theater, that I was trying to audition, and I wasn't really loud enough. And young Leah Chase, the singer, was in this production too, and she said, you should go and see my voice teacher, Charles Paddock. And so when he heard me sing, he heard something that I didn't know was there. So I just took his guidance and said, okay, well, maybe it's something I can do. And then I always tell people, my mother again, I remember sitting next to her as she was watching an opera singer, Mario Lanza, on television, and she was so enthralled and so she just loved it. And I was like, oh, what is this? And my mother had to leave school at 8th grade because her family was poor. She had to work. She was not, you know, but her love of culture was just beautiful and intense, and my father as well. Um, so I started studying classical music, and I wasn't at the point of being operatic yet, but some of my friends would say, "Well, why are you doing that?" Because every Saturday I had to take like 2 buses and walk about 5 blocks to get to his house, and they were out playing around. Why are you going to go do that? And I said, I just have to do it. And my father said to me, the civil rights movement and all of that stuff is happening, people giving their lives so you can be whoever you want to be. And whoever you want to be, your mom and I, we have you. We got you. We got your back.
Mm.
And it turned out to be absolutely true. And as long as they lived, they were with me, very proud. And so I went on to Loyola, and my life was made. That's all I
Mm.
can say.
And
He
what what
Paddock
was your
also taught at Loyola, so he brought me along with him. Yeah.
what was your who was the first Creole of color composer that you learned about?
It was actually Samuel Snair. It was somebody asked a couple of us from Loyola to sing his Mass for Three Voices.
Hmm.
And so that was the first that I learned about, and he was the organist at St. Mary's. It's now called St. Mary's Italian, attached to the Ursuline Convent, the older Ursuline Convent in the French Quarter. And so that was when I first learned about him. And when Opera Creole had our inaugural concert, we did it in St. Mary's Italian, and we opened the concert with the Mass for Three Voices
Mm.
with my friend Marcus St. Julian on the organ. It was his sister, Thais St. Julian, who was also an historian, who asked us to sing the mass. So he was the first, and Edmond Dede was the second. He was just destined to be in my life.
Hmm. And you have such incredible talent in your company. I mean, every
Oh
time I
yeah,
go to a performance, I'm just blown away. And
oh yeah,
you know, it's amazing. If you've, I'm encouraging my audience, if ever, you're in New Orleans and there's an Opera Creole performance, you must attend. You must
yeah.
attend. There's nothing like it, you know.
People,
Uh,
when I've sung with New Orleans Opera, and these mega stars would come in, and they would hear just the chorus. They were like, "We were just at the Met, and the chorus didn't sound like this." It's
mm.
amazing the voices we have in New Orleans, and I say it's in the Mississippi water. I don't know, but
Do you think also that it's also the opera houses because I think the Maroney Opera House, there's so many beautiful opera houses that need repairing,
yeah,
or and preservation. But then
yeah,
there's some that have come back, and the acoustics, it's
yeah.
such a it wraps you up,
Oh yeah,
it
absolutely.
embraces you. And I would love for you to talk about just opera houses and the significance of opera houses in New Orleans when it was at its peak.
Oh, well, we were the opera mecca of America before New York. And at one point we had, well, We had a total of 5 opera houses over a period of time, often 2 operating at the same time. 1796 was the St. Peter Street Theater, then there was St. Philip, then there was Camp Street, then there was the German Theater, then there was the St. Charles Theater, and finally the French well, no, before that, the Orleans Theater, Théâtre d'Orléans, and then the French Opera House, and then later, and I just learned this a year ago, where the Crest 5 and Dime store was. I don't know if you knew about that, but now it's part of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. That was the Grand Opera House on Canal Street.
Mm,
So we
mm,
had many, and to give you an idea, like the St. Charles Theater, the footprint is now the Intercontinental Hotel on St. Charles and Poydras. The German Theater is now the footprint of Le Pavillon on Poydras.
mm,
Um, the French Opera House is the footprint of the Four Points Sheraton on Bourbon and oh, what is that corner? Drew a blank. But anyway, so these were large houses. These were not, just a little something in the corner,
mhm,
serious opera houses. Yeah.
mm.
Um,
And that brings me to Marian Anderson.
ah,
Yes, she came to the famous opera singer.
yes.
I wrote about her in my book,
Ah,
Recipes and Remembrances of Fair Dillard.
yeah.
For those of my audience who are not familiar, wrote a book about the culinary history of Dillard University. And in our library, I've Malik Bartholomew, who is also a historian in New
Yeah.
Orleans, he said, I've got this cookbook in the archives that's been sitting here since the 1950s. And I was blown away because in that cookbook, it was a fundraising cookbook that Jessie Dent, who was the first lady of Dillard at the time,
Mhm.
President Dent's wife, she was a classic pianist who studied at Juilliard. She graduated from Juilliard, and she collected all of these musicians and artists of the time, and Marian Anderson was one of them, and she asked them to contribute recipes to this cookbook to raise scholarships for students, and Marian Anderson was one of them. And
Yeah.
just researching about her and her
Yeah.
coming to New Orleans, and it was a Jewish family, the Stearns, Edith and
Oh,
Edgar
that's the same
Stern.
family that was, Louis Armstrong's, benefactor?
Right,
Right?
right.
Yeah.
Who, embraced her and invited her in because she wasn't allowed to
Yes.
play to an integrated audience. And,
Yes.
she turned down a performance, if not, I'm not mistaken. I
Mm.
would love for you to just talk about Marian Anderson and some of the female leads who, really impacted opera and changed um, American music forever.
Once I got to Loyola, my voice teacher, Charles Paddock, sent me to the library. He said, "I want you to hear a recording of Marian Anderson." And not long after that, I think she was on the Ed Sullivan Show or something. Um, and recording wasn't so that great back then, so I kept thinking, "Wow, this is phenomenal," because she was called the voice of the century. I thought, what would happen if she had today's recording? So I knew I wasn't hearing the full voice, but I was blown away. And when I saw her on television, it was a thing. I felt like the way she stood and presented in such dignity, without saying a word, she was changing the world. for,
Mm,
for people to understand something different about a Black woman, about Black people. She just in her excellence and her demeanor and her dignity, just it just blew me away. And I kept saying, I want to stand up like that when I sing. I want to feel something really special when I sing and help other people feel something special. And when she stood at the Lincoln Memorial, she changed the world. She didn't say, "Hey, y'all better get it together." She didn't tell anybody off. But when she stood and sang, and I do a concert in homage to her, um, where I put Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen and My Country 'Tis of Thee together. But
Mm,
when she sang My Country 'Tis of Thee, um, uh, you could almost, just in the recordings of the video, as it's not fabulous, but you can almost feel the atmosphere change, like the chemistry of the air changed, and people understanding "Let Freedom Ring" in a different way. Then I learned that when she was at the Lincoln Memorial and all the thousands and thousands of people came out, but there were thousands of people on the radio, one of which was a 9-year-old little boy by the name of Martin Luther King.
mm,
And he heard her sing "Let Freedom Ring," and that's what ended up in his speech when he got to the Lincoln Memorial.
wow.
Yes, and he
I
asked
never
her
knew that.
to come. Yeah, and so she got into the psyche of a little boy,
Mm.
and we know that he changed the world. So
Whew.
you just never know as a singer. You standing there, you think you're singing a song, and there's somebody out there that it means something totally different for them and sends them on the path that they're supposed to go on. Um, and I just think she's just amazing. Love her so much. But then years
Mm,
later, I thought she was the first, but then I found out about Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, who was born enslaved, and her owner joined the Quakers, and wanted nothing to do with slavery, sent her parents back to Africa, paid for her to get voice lessons, and she made her debut in Philadelphia and then ended up in England singing for Queen Victoria. And Ciceretta Jones, who traveled the world, she was economically uh, uh, pretty rich, and she came to New Orleans and performed with through I think it was a program at Xavier. Um, and so there was all these women that came before Marian Anderson and paved the way, but history washed them out by the time we turned into the 1900s. Um, and so there's just so many wonderful women like that who paved paved a wonderful way for all of us.
mm.
Yeah.
So there would be no jazz without the early classically trained Creole musicians. How has opera influenced jazz?
Well, jazz has some European chord structure, uh, but it has African and Caribbean rhythms and um, other aspects of the chord structure that the two kind of came together. So, perfect example is Jelly Roll Morton, who was inspired to play the piano when he went to a piano recital at the French Opera House. And his grandmother said, well, if you want to play the piano, you have to learn classically because those other musicians are just people trying to ditch work. They don't know what they're doing. So you have to learn real music and how to music theory and notation and all of that. And he did.
Mm,
Um, but because of the era that he lived, and we were kicked out of the experience of playing in the opera houses and that sort of thing, he ended up getting work in the brothels. Of course, his grandmother found out and she kicked him out. So she was not she was not happy about that. But the classical musicians coming together with musicians that had this Caribbean specialty and these African rhythm specialties. Um, I always tell young people you have to expand your musical horizons because that's how new music gets made. And so they came together, and even in the brothels, they were playing classical music. They were playing overtures to the operas because it was almost the same public. If they had money to go to the opera, they had money to spend at the brothels.
yes, indeed.
But Buddy Bolden could also play classical pieces, and it was a revolution that happened musically. one of the things that I like about that's still one thing that jazz and opera have in common. I understand. I think I heard Carl LeBlanc saying that because of all of the Jim Crow laws and all of the things that were um, trying to diminish Black men in particular, that in the jazz structure they wanted each musician to have an opportunity to speak from him for himself through his instrument. And so you see that structure where they're all playing together, and then one person has that moment to just speak, then another person has their moment to speak, and it's almost as if I'm using my instrument to make a declarative statement. Well, in opera, there is a voice type called coloratura. It's someone that sings a lot of fancy, fancy, fancy notes, and the voice moves very fast. In that structure, usually when the coloratura wants to make a declarative statement, um, and she's about to tell the audience, I'm getting ready to get this guy. He thinks but I'm gonna tell you what I'm getting ready to do. And so she steps out. The music is written for her, but that's the only voice in opera that gets to improvise. So just like the jazz people step forward, they make their declarative statement and they improvise, the opera coloratura can do that as well. Marilyn Horne was magical at doing that. So even though they had these notes that were already written, they used them, but they could go further, higher, and make their own declarative statement. And so we have things in common still, and it's not often what we talk about, but I really
Mm,
love that. And Louis Armstrong loved that. And I always tell people that I believe that because he loved coloratura singing, that it may have had some influence in his development of the scat. So
mm,
they're almost identical in the way they're structured, and so um, I love that.
mm. And I mean, just of course, it was some influence in that because I mean, if there were, you know, singing opera on the corner somewhere,
Oh
you just
yeah,
randomly walk around and,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
of course.
I think it might have been Lafcadio or Hearn, if I'm not mistaken. I can't swear by it. One of the historians that came to New Orleans just wanted to write about what he saw, and then when he saw this enslaved woman pushing a cart, singing a perfect operatic aria, it was like, what?
Mm, mm, mm,
So we have every bit of ownership in this musical genre as anyone else.
mm. And to think of all those street food vendors, the oyster man, the
Oh
popcorn
yeah,
man.
everybody was singing. Anything you wanted to sell, you was singing.
Mm,
And also, I almost forgot another woman interesting to New Orleans. She was born in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, but she made her operatic debuts, the first Black soloist for French opera in Haiti at 14,
mm,
Minette Ferrand, and she sang French opera in Haiti, Saint-Domingue at the time. And she was involved in the Haitian Revolution, and she moved to New Orleans.
mm, mm.
And I can't, I don't know if she sang while she was in New Orleans, but her funeral was in the cathedral.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's all of this just wonderful, rich history, and people don't even think of Haiti as having opera, but they had an opera house in every little village.
Mm.
And
And
some of them who came here were people who had experience in opera that managed some of our first opera houses.
mm.
Yeah.
New Orleans is getting a lot of attention, especially now with our new pope. How
We got
did
a
you
new
feel
pope.
when you heard that he is actually Creole?
Yes, yes. At our concert on Sunday, our Juneteenth concert, I took the spiritual and I changed the last verse. And I'm not warmed up, but I'm gonna just do a teeny bit. But I said, "The good Lord sent us a new pope of Black New Orleans heritage. DEI, the good Lord said, divine ecumenical intervention." I had to throw that in there.
Oh, New Orleans is a special place. Ooh, Yes, indeed.
I say, y'all want to get rid of DEI, and all of a sudden, here comes the Pope. Like, forget about
Lord have mercy. Oh,
it.
oh man, was a wonderful conversation. What can we do to support Opera Creole? For any of my listeners who love opera, who love the arts, who want to support untold stories, unsung heroes, what can we do to support Opera Creole?
Oh, just go to our website, operacreole.org. Donate what you can. We have a wonderful auction that's happening if you're a real art collector. I had the artist Andrew Lamar Hopkins do a special painting for us. Um, and he said, well, my Marie Laveau paintings tend to sell very well. So I said, well, could you put her in the opera house? And that's what he did.
Ooh.
So we have a painting of Marie Laveau in the opera house, who turns out to be my ancestral aunt. That's a whole nother story. But and then we have a few products on our in our store on the website. So whatever people can do, with the destruction of the National Endowment for the Arts, a lot of people are really getting hit hard. And one of our partners that we were supposed to go back to Washington, D.C. for performance, they had $25,000 revoked in the loss of the NEA funds. And so it's a really difficult time. So any donation, I call it defending the arts, because we need all the help that we can.
Thank you, my dear friend. Thank you for
Thank
your work.
you.
Thank you for your mission. Thank you for your beautiful daughter, Arya. Please give her my
Oh,
love.
yes, yes. And
And your
and you have
grandbaby.
my daughter in your film too, because
I do.
she was there helping to restore Dookie Chase after Katrina. Yeah,
Yes.
so that's really
Yes.
great. But much love to you, Zella. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Thank y'all for listening to Culture and Flavor. We're going to end this episode with a live performance from Opera Creole. I'm so excited for you all to hear this phenomenal company by Madame Givonna Joseph. I hope you all enjoy it. Please do support the arts. Please do support Opera Creole.
Your concerts were divine as your violin sang. Le comité citoyen is honored to present you, even if only in our homes and in l'église. Merci, Monsieur Dédine, but I must go back to France, back to France. The people here treat me like a Quasimodo, you know, the hunchback de Notre Dame. But the racial danger here is such a burden.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Yeah. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.